Judges. Introduction. The book of Judges traces the story of Israel in the land that God has given them from the death of Joshua until the time just before Samuel, the last of the judges. The leaders of Israel at this time were called judges. There are 12 judges described in this book. But it's important to realize that the judges weren't legal figures in the way we normally use that word in English today. Their role was not to make legal decisions in a courtroom. They were actually leaders who were raised up by God in a crisis to rescue the people of Israel from their enemies. Although the judges are sometimes described as leading the whole nation of Israel like Moses did and Joshua, they're often regional rulers, not ruling the whole nation. And the judges are not always portrayed in this book as being holy people. They're not always good examples for us. In fact, a number of them are deeply flawed characters. Take the story of Samson that we find in this book. It makes a great Sunday school story, but it's difficult to draw many positive moral lessons from Samson's life. We don't want our sons growing up to become bragging, testosterone-charged, revenge-seeking womanizers. It makes us wonder why Samson's story is recorded for us in the Bible at all. We'll come back to that question at the end. Interestingly, after the death of Joshua, no provision was made for succession of leadership in the way that Joshua had been appointed to replace Moses. Israel then was left without any consistent leadership at that time. And so the question is, without consistent godly leadership, would the people of Israel continue to be godly? Well, that question is answered with an emphatic no in the book of Judges. This would prove to be a dark time for Israel. This period is characterized by a cycle, or maybe more accurately, a downward spiral of disobedience, as the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord again and again. The book of Judges shows us what happens when people turn their backs on God. It teaches us that we ignore God and his laws at our peril. This was a chaotic period of Israel's history. An overview of Judges. The book divides into 3 parts. The first part is chapter 1 through to chapter 2, verse 5. We could call it Causes of Failure, the incomplete conquest of Canaan. These chapters emphasize for us the fact that the Canaanites had not been driven out of the land of Canaan by the people of Israel, and that this was an act of disobedience and disloyalty to their covenant with God. Because of their failure to obey him, God declares in these chapters that now he wouldn't drive the people out of the land. These people and their false gods would become traps and snares for the people of Israel. As an act of judgment, God would give them what they'd chosen for themselves. The next section is chapter 2, verse 6 through to chapter 16. Cycles of misery. Israel in the period of the Judges. Look at the exercise on slide 1. What's being described in these verses? Judges 2, 16 to 19, and then chapter 3, verses 7 to 11. Please pause the video at this point so that you can answer the question. What's being described in these verses? Well, we see a pattern emerging. God repeatedly and graciously raises up a leader, a judge, to save his people from themselves and from their enemies. But then, when the judge dies, they return to their evil ways and they become even more corrupt than they were before. Look at the cycle in diagram 1 in your notes. Israel sins, top of the diagram, which leads to God's judgment. Israel is oppressed, which leads to Israel repenting and crying out to God, which leads to God sending a judge, a saviour, a deliverer, which then leads to a period of peace and prosperity, which then leads to Israel sinning again, and so it goes on, around and around. In these chapters, chapter 2, verse 6 through to chapter 16, this cycle is repeated 6 times, with slight variations, for the 6 judges: Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. In each of these accounts, the judge delivers God's people from harm. But it's clear here that actually it's God who's saving people. He's the one who's at work through his chosen deliverer. We see God actually being remarkably responsive to the prayers of his wayward people as they cry to him for help. As well as those stories of the 6 main characters, we have mention made of 6 other judges, making 12 judges in all. Which brings us finally to the last section, chapters 17 to 21. Curses from failure, idolatry, immorality, and anarchy. These last chapters demonstrate the total depravity of Israelite society at this time. Here we find the story of Micah's idols and the tribe of Dan, and the story of the Levite's concubine and the tribe of Benjamin. These were dark days for Israel. Look at the exercise on slide 2. There are 2 phrases that are repeated throughout the book of Judges. The first is the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. The second is in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. What do these 2 phrases tell us about this period in Israel's history? Please pause the video at this point to answer the question. What do these 2 phrases tell us about this period in Israel's history? Well, they establish 2 facts for us. First, that the people of Israel were unable to resist sin. And secondly, that God's people needed a godly king. The author is no doubt writing at a later time when there was a king in Israel. And he sees that the answer to the evil and the anarchy in Israel that characterized this period of their history was to have a good king to rule over them. The book of Judges actually leaves the reader longing for Israel to have godly leadership again. Finally, let's think about the importance of the book of Judges for Christians. First of all, Judges gives us the background to the book of Ruth. Ruth is set in the time of the Judges, but it's a wholesome story compared to the chaotic evil of the end of Judges. If the book of Judges is a cold shower, then the book of Ruth is like a warm bath. If you're feeling depressed by this book, the book of Ruth is a lot more uplifting. Next, the book of Judges shows us the downward spiral of sin. It teaches us about who we are without God. It shows us our total depravity and why we need God to intervene in our lives by sending us a Saviour. It's clear that we need God to fight our battles for us. It's also clear that God is long-suffering in his dealings with a rebellious humanity. You and I are deeply flawed by nature. Next, the book of Judges prepares us for kingship as the next step. Israel does not fare well during this period of the Judges, and the author leaves us longing for a good king over Israel. Now that longing will be met in part by King David. He's the godly king of Israel who will shortly step onto the pages of Israel's history. But however great David proved to be, he too proved to be flawed by personal sin. The judges are heroes, but they're flawed heroes who make us long for a perfect one. They're sin-flawed saviours, if you like, who leave us longing for a better saviour. Why is Samson's story in the Bible? We asked that question earlier. Well, despite his many failings, you'll notice that he's listed in Hebrews chapter 11 as a person who put his faith in God. But the writer to the Hebrews includes all of these Old Testament heroes of faith to encourage his readers to fix their eyes upon Jesus. You see, finally, the longing of the book of Judges for an end to sin, for a perfect Saviour, for a godly King, all of those longings are met in Jesus. His victory over sin at the cross on behalf of God's people was won through perfect obedience. The salvation that the judges brought was temporary, but Jesus saves completely, once for all time. Jesus is God's final answer to the problem of sin.